we'll get started. All right, so welcome back everyone and happy Tuesday. This is day 4 of our summer training series, and today we will be covering the developing adolescent brain. So we're going to get our science on, we're going to nerd out a little bit, but it'll be a lot of fun. So first things first, we're going to do a little quiz. If I can figure out how to find the quiz here. So there are 5 questions to this quiz. It's a true or false, and it's just kind of to get us thinking. We will answer every question during the session today, so it'll give you an idea of what you know, what you need to know, and maybe, you know, if you don't know what you don't know, this will be a great way to measure that. So I'm going to launch this. You can answer all 5 questions. You might have to scroll down to answer them all. We're talking about brains. So we're talking about the prefrontal cortex and synaptic pruning and neuroplasticity, all kinds of fun stuff today. So do your best on the quiz. Okay. Got a couple more people waiting to answer. We're pretty split on some of these. We'll have some good discussion. Okay, so we're going to go through the rest of our session. We're going to answer all of these. So I'll pop this quiz back up towards the end, and we'll kind of see how we did, and kind of work through some of this together throughout. But thank you all for just kind of getting to thinking about what you know. Now, I asked one of the pre-questions was, you know, how familiar are you with some of the latest research on the adolescent brain development? I know if any of you are in our SEO CASA Facebook group, we share quite a bit about trauma's impact on the brain and how that can stymie development, and how that can actually alter and change structures within the brains because of the synaptic pruning that we're going to talk about later today. So never stop learning, right? As what we know about the brain is constantly evolving. As many of you probably know, up until, this side of 10 years ago, we really thought the brain was kind of done developing once someone reached about 20 years old. And now we know that the brain is continuing to develop well into adulthood, well into 26, 27 years old, before the brain is fully developed and we have that full executive function. So what we know about the brain is constantly changing and evolving. And all of us have experience working within systems that help children, whether it's a court system, CASA, a school, healthcare. We know that all of those systems don't always necessarily keep up with the research, right? The research and kind of what we learn and what we know changes much faster than our practice or than our policy. So us as child advocates, we kind of have to find that balance and strike that balance. And one way we do that is by learning as much as we possibly can and thinking of those small ways that we can implement that into our practice. So that's what we'll be talking about today. We're going to start by showing you a quick video. A lot of you have been in my trauma trainings before, so you've seen me do the hand brain and how the brain reacts to trauma. And I use this hand brain visualization. This is actually going to explain brain development using that hand model. And then here in a couple of weeks, we'll actually dive into trauma's impact on brain development, and we'll revisit this hand brain again later. But This is a quick video that it kind of explains it, and this is a great tool and demonstration to use with young people to help them understand their own brain development. Oh, it sounds like you all can't hear it. Let me try that again. Okay. Now let's see. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
There are four major parts of the brain that develop from the back to the front and from the inside out. And we're going to use a visual to help walk through those. So you can feel free to just watch or follow along if that's helpful. I'm going to use my hand as a way to visualize how the brain develops. So the first part to develop is the brainstem. So we'll say that's right here. And given all things healthy physically, this part of the brain is developed by the time you're born, and that houses your unconscious functions. So things like your blood pressure, your body temperature, your heart rate, things of that nature. The second major part of the brain to develop is the midbrain. So we'll say that's right here. And that houses things like your sleep and wake cycle, your appetite, your motor regulation, and your auditory and visual processing. The third major part of the brain to develop is the limbic system. So we'll say that's the thumb and come across right here, and that's the emotional center of the brain. So that houses our reactive and protective instincts. That's where fear lives. That's also where attachment and sexual behavior is housed. And it's a really robust part of the brain that we rely heavily on during our formative years. The last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. So we'll fold that right over. That's the part of the brain that develops right behind the forehead. And this houses what many call executive skills or executive function. So those are things like your ability to plan ahead, your ability to think critically and delay gratification, to focus your attention, and your ability to introspect, your ability to look inward, say, what am I experiencing and why? And it also houses your abilities and skills to regulate emotions and control impulses that are happening in the limbic system. While this is the last part of the brain to develop, it is critical in order to thrive into adulthood.
Thank you, everyone, for alerting me to the sound issue. I kind of wondered if that would happen because I have earbuds in today. So thanks for letting me know. So quickly, I love the hand brain as a model, particularly when I'm working with young people and kind of helping them understand what's happening and kind of what's happening in their brains. And, I think many of you have been in my trauma trainings before where you've heard me describe this limbic system as kind of the smoke alarm of our brain, right? It's what keeps us safe and alerts us when there's danger. This is that primitive part of our brain. And when we use that kind of terminology and that visualization with young people, it gives us a common language so that they can understand. So feel free, we'll revisit the hand brain a couple more times throughout the summer series, but I think it's a great thing that kids can understand. So just as a reminder, the brain develops from the back to the front and from the inside out. And so when you're thinking about, those essential primitive parts of your brain are occurring on the inside of your brain. And then we kind of have those back, that occipital lobe, that cerebellum developing. And then, finally, we see that prefrontal cortex. That's that very front. If you think about it, it's the part right underneath your forehead. That's that final part of your brain to develop. So again, that brainstem here in this graphic, it's depicted as that spinal cord area. That's the first part of our brain that develops, and it's completely developed by the time that we're born. And again, that's where all the things we don't have to think about, our brain does it for us, right? Nobody's sitting there reminding their heart to beat or reminding their lungs to be functioning, reminding yourself to regulate your body temperature. Our brains do that for us. It kind of is that vital systems check of our bodies. And then of course we have that midbrain. That's that middle section part there. That's what we really see developing in early childhood. I know in some of the pre-questions, a lot of you had quite a bit of training and education related to early childhood development. So a lot of that's focusing on, those kind of auditory visual processing, motor regulations, those, appetites, kind of settling into those sleep wake routines. That's why young children really thrive in those routine driven environments. You've probably all heard conversation about there's this kind of language window when someone really develops language, and that's a lot of that midbrain function that's developing there. And then of course the limbic system. This is my favorite part of the brain to learn about because I do a lot of work in trauma-informed care and trauma-sensitive care and trauma competence. And that's really a part of the brain that we focus on in TIC, as well as I think many of you know, in my past life before I came to CASA, I was a forensic interviewer. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the limbic system because it has a way of impacting the way memories are coded, which is important when we're helping someone to share a narrative about their trauma. So, and again, that prefrontal cortex is actually the last part of our brain to develop. And that was one of the questions there. And that's, those kind of higher level, higher order thinking, that focusing, thinking critically, being able to anticipate, all of those are some of those higher level, higher order executive functions. Another shift here, probably done looking at that brain picture. So one interesting thing that we know about the brain is that, again, I already said our brains are developing a lot longer than we used to think that they were. And again, that kind of adolescence, when we think about adolescent brains, we really are probably looking at a window that spans from about 10 years old to about 26 or 27 years old when we're thinking about from a brain development perspective. And it's not necessarily just categorized by age, because, the 10-year-old brain of, child A might be different than the 10-year-old brain of child B, because once people are born and they start having all these experiences, that can shape the way that their brains are developing as well. And so one really interesting and unique thing that humans are able to do is to kind of mold our own brains through thinking and planning and learning and acting. And a lot of that's play, right? And those kind of experiential type moments of our lives. And this concept is called neuroplasticity, which is our brains are really malleable during adolescence and uniquely malleable during adolescence. And it just means that our brains and the structures within our brain can change shape in response to experiences. So that can be in response to positive developmental, kind of developmentally nurturing experiences, as well as traumatic experiences. You've probably heard that someone who is experiencing chronic stress or chronic trauma might have issues with cognition, right? They might get confused or have trouble remembering things. That's because of this concept, this kind of neuroplasticity that can happen within our brain. It has a lot of implications for the rewiring and kind of the healing when a young person or anyone really has experienced trauma. And we'll be talking a lot more about trauma here in a couple of weeks. But all of this is interconnected. So the way that the brain develops in a very positive and helpful way carries just as many implications for us when we're thinking about someone who's experienced trauma. Rochelle asked a good question in the chat box. Is there any difference between males and females for the time duration for a fully functioning or fully developed brain? There is some research that suggests that the prefrontal cortex develops a little bit slower for males. And so if you're thinking about the whole brain, it's not that the male brain develops slower than the female brain, it's that it develops differently. So a lot of those executive functions, those tend to happen a little bit faster in a female brain than in a male brain. But some of those sensory parts of the brain might develop faster in a male brain than in a female brain. And when I'm saying male and female, I'm meaning hormone related, male and female. So it's not necessarily that the male brain develops slower, it just is that it develops differently. So, and we tend to think of brain development, we measure that by maturity, and that's only one measure, because another measure of brain development might be sensory development, might mean, some sort of, critical response time, those types of things. So it just develops differently. But there is some research that suggests that the male brain's prefrontal cortex does take a little bit longer than the female brain. But there's obviously a lot of factors that could impact that. Another concept that I wanted to introduce you to, or reintroduce you to if you've already heard of this, is pruning. Brain pruning is kind of pruning away that gray matter that exists in between different parts of the brain. So we have these structures of the brain, and then we have this kind of gray matter that is, it kind of, when we think about brain pruning, what it's really doing is kind of clearing the way for those synapses, which are little communication channels within our brains that we kind of send little nodes of electricity, little messages back and forth through. And so when we, through that synaptic pruning process, we actually kind of create habits, routines within our brain structures, and it can improve like communication between cells or different parts of the brain. So when we have someone who's kind of stimulating their brain in a certain way over and over and over, that synaptic pruning can occur. And then we're going to see kind of a propensity for one task or one function over the other. And that can be a very positive thing. Sometimes that can be in response to a trauma or kind of a negative event. There's this concept in brain, in trauma-informed care that we call, if it fires together, it wires together. And so if you consistently have a stimuli and a reaction to that stimuli, and it happens over and over and over and over, through that synaptic pruning process, we're going to create new channels, new synaptic channels that creates those kind of pathways. And that's that fires together, wires together type thing. That's how we explain some of those unconscious reactions to things. So you've all, heard stories of someone who's been to war and then they return home and they're still reacting to similar stimuli in the same way, because again, they've had that neuroplasticity taking its toll, and then this pruning, this firing together and wiring together phenomenon. So interesting fun fact is that during adolescence, as many as 30,000 synapses, which is those kind of connection pathways, but 30,000 synapses may be lost per second over the entire cerebral cortex. That's that outer part of our brain. So as these unused synapses, when we don't use them, they kind of go away, right? That's the brain pruning. So as those are being pruned away, these other neurons are being strengthened. And again, this is called, the process there when we strengthen some of those pathways is called myelination. And that's what lends us to have a certain strength or a certain kind of propensity for, managing one part of our brain function maybe better than others. And so the things that we reinforce and that we kind of act on are strengthened. That's the myelination. And then what's not reinforced, what's not being used, kind of gets pruned away. So it's kind of a use it or lose it type thing. That's also why when I talked about that midbrain and language development, it tends to be a lot easier for young children to learn new languages than for us as adults. If suddenly one of us wanted to learn Mandarin, that might be a little more difficult for us than it would be for our 4-year-old English speaking child to then, also learn that other language. So it's really prime time for adolescents to be able to wire their brains in kind of those positive ways to kind of use it and improve those brain skills. So let's think here. If we were to take advantage of this, right, we can kind of leverage these naturally occurring processes, and we can use them, especially in our work with youth who have experienced abuse or neglect or experienced chronic trauma, but we can actually use this as an opportunity for healing. So it's really important that we understand how young people process information and how they make decisions. So we know young people are still developing, still figuring out how to use those skills in the prefrontal cortex, right? We've all been exposed to a teenager who did not make a good decision. And you're kind of sitting there scratching your head as the adult saying, how did they arrive at this decision that this was a good idea? But that's what happens, right? We don't have all of those prefrontal cortex. That executive functioning isn't fully developed yet. So we see this shift when we see young people entering adolescence and entering their teenage years. We see the shift where they're slowly starting to rely less and less on using emotion and using impulse to kind of drive those decisions that they're making, and really starting to see this shift into using those skills in the prefrontal cortex that can help them, reflect, use critical thinking, and kind of slow down some of those decisions. If you've been in any of my trauma trainings, you've heard me call that concept resilience, where it's kind of that space between a stimulus and our reaction to that stimulus. And that space can be larger or smaller, depending on those kind of what the stimulus is and where we are functioning wise in all of that. So we can really take advantage of the science as the supportive adults in a teenager or a young person's life by kind of requiring or insisting on creating opportunities for them to practice those skills in a safe way, all the skills that help myelinate and help create those synaptic pathways for them. So we can take this kind of, use this to our advantage a little bit. Any questions? I've thrown a lot of terms out there, but any questions so far? Rochelle shares a great comment about talking to her students about pruning, those synaptic pruning, because a lot of them don't start their foreign languages until 14 years old. Oh yeah, and Rochelle, you're a Spanish teacher, right? And so once they kind of start using those connections, it can be hard, but you got to kind of keep doing it. You got to practice and kind of take advantage of that fire together, wires together. Absolutely. So I'm going to share, this is also in Google Classroom, but just so you have it handy, I just dropped in the chat box a glossary. I've used up probably some terms that maybe might be new to some of you or ones that you haven't heard in a while. And if you want to help just keep all that straight, I dropped the brain terminology glossary into the chat box. But it's also on your Google Classroom, so you have access to it that way. Okay, so let's do another little video here. And this one will talk about why the teenage brain has this advantage from an evolutionary perspective over our adult brain. So this, and again, it's this myelination and this neuroplasticity that lends itself to a lot of opportunities for us as those supportive adults in that teenager's life or that adolescent's life. So stop me if there's any issues with the video, flag me down and we'll start it over.
It's not easy being a teenager. There's the angst, the emotions, the raging hormones. And although hormones do play a big role in puberty, the brain is going through a lot of changes too. Neuroscientists are learning that some of the most puzzling teenage behavior may actually have some real benefits. Legally, you're considered an adult when you turn 18. But from the neuroscience perspective, your brain is really still developing.
And the current literature suggests that it's about around age 25 or so is when the brain finishes the period of adolescence.
This is Dr. Adriana Galvin, and she runs the Developmental Neuroscience Lab at UCLA. The brain develops from the back to the front, so the prefrontal cortex is the last region to fully develop.
The prefrontal cortex is part of the brain you need to make good decisions, to think about the future, think about consequences.
You can kind of think of it like the Spock of the brain, logical, calm, and collected. And then deeper in the brain, there are these emotional systems like the limbic system that are more interested in immediate gratification. They're sort of like Captain Kirk, a risk taker and a bit emotional. During the teenage years, the limbic system develops really quickly, and the prefrontal cortex is trying to catch up. Eventually, as individuals become adults, the prefrontal cortex will increasingly have more influence over behavior than the impulsive part of the brain. So, without a fully developed prefrontal cortex, you can kind of see why teens might be more impulsive or just worry less about future consequences. Another brain region that's really active during adolescence is this thing called the striatum, and it's a key part of the brain's reward system. Let's say you find 20 bucks on the street, or someone gives you a cookie. The striatum goes off, and it releases dopamine into the brain. Adriana's lab discovered that the teenage brain is super sensitive to different rewards like sugar and money. Way more than in the brains of adults and children. And all this activity in the brain's reward center, it may actually serve a purpose.
We asked teenagers to come to the lab and we scanned their brains while they performed a learning task. They were shown a picture of a butterfly and 2 flowers, and they were asked to guess which flower the butterfly would land on.
After each guess, they were given feedback. When the teens got it right, their striatum would get really active.
They would learn over time that the butterfly preferred one flower over the other. And everybody learned this task, but what we found is that the adolescents learned it more quickly than adults and with greater accuracy.
So having this reward center that's hyper-responsive to feedback actually helps teenagers learn from their environment. But this same region of the brain is also connected to risk-taking. Data from Adriana's lab suggests that teens with a more reactive striatum are more likely to engage in risky behavior and to enjoy it.
Rather than ask how you keep your teenager from taking risks, because we know the brain is really oriented towards risk during this time, it's better to ask, how do I provide opportunities for healthy risks?
Like trying out for the school play, even if you've never acted before, or asking someone out on a date. Those are real risks to a teenager, but they're not the kind of risks that parents typically worry about.
It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that there's a time in life when teenagers want to become more independent, seek out new opportunities. In the animal world, this would translate into looking for new food resources or foraging behavior. And in teenagers, it often manifests as risk-taking behavior and simply moving away from the family unit.
Teenagers are going to make mistakes, but they've got this brain that's encouraging them to learn and explore and push boundaries.
So adolescence is a really special time, and I think we don't appreciate enough their energy and their ability to lead and to motivate, and how excitable they find life in a way that we maybe we don't later in life.
Our brains keep changing throughout our lives, and researchers at UC Berkeley are learning that if you give people a little bit of power, it can have a big effect on the brain. Learn more by watching our video here, and be sure to subscribe for more Figure 1.
Okay. So there's some interesting things that when I watch this video and when I think about what we know about adolescence, what we know about teenagers, let's say, if we're going to focus on kind of a window within adolescence, is it's when we think about our child welfare system, a lot of our child welfare system, a lot of those policies, and I'm talking over the last 100 years, the way that we do business in child welfare, in child abuse, child neglect work, dependency work, so much of that work and so much of that policy and practice was built on what we know about young children, small children, right? 10 and under children. Even, in the United States, the very first time that we really started looking at protecting children against maltreatment, it was with small children in mind, with young children in mind. So much of the work that we do, that kind of bag of tricks that we have in child welfare, was born out of that work of protecting small children, because it's easy to understand why, right? The protective capacity of a smaller child is much different than that of a teenager. The vulnerability to risk and to identifying and kind of seeking help and seeking assistance is much different when we're talking about a 7-year-old versus a 15 or a 16-year-old who can access help and who can speak and talk about what's happening to them. And that's very different. So here we kind of have this child welfare system. We've tried to expand and like fit our work with teens and adolescents into it, right? We've tried to fit them into that box, but you can all, if you've had a teenager on your caseload, you can probably think about sometimes how the processes and the policies and the practice doesn't always necessarily fit neatly with the needs of our teenage clients. And then let's look at another system that our teens often are interacting with, and that's the juvenile justice system. How many of you have worked with a teen that's involved with like probation, juvenile probation, or things like that? You've had a little bit of experience with this. You know, that the juvenile justice system was not designed, right? It wasn't, hey, we need a way to address teenagers who commit crimes or teenagers who engage in delinquency. We modeled that system off of our adult penal system. So here we have teens who kind of often are getting served by these two systems that weren't really designed with them in mind. And, you know, oftentimes we kind of want to treat teenagers as if they're just really big kids, right? A lot of times that's how we approach it. They're just a really big kid. And that's how we approach our work with them. Or we're taking the other side of the kind of continuum there, the other extreme, as you're treating them as if they're just like small adults, right? Because they kind of look like adults. They kind of start to sound like grown-ups, but they're not. So I think that's one role that we all as advocates and as supportive kind of people that operate within these systems and at the cross sections of these systems, where we can get a little creative and arm ourselves with this knowledge that we have and this understanding that we have of teenage brain development and what they need and why they're exercising this in this risk-taking behavior, and help kind of sort all that out in our systems. But it is something we kind of have to think about it. And if you really, I hope when you kind of reflect back on today's conversation, you might think a little bit about, well, gosh, yeah, so much of even the way that case plans are written were really designed with small children in mind, right? Then we later on added this kind of independent living work and some of this other stuff. But a lot of those systems, a lot of our policy, if you look through Ohio Revised Code or Ohio Administrative Code, a lot of that is written with small, somewhat defenseless children in mind, and not necessarily in this work that we do that floats between these systems when we're working with older youth and with teens. Does anyone have anything to add? Does that trigger or make anyone think of anything or an example, or have any questions so far? Okay.
It's not easy being a teenager. There's the angst.
I always have trouble with the video. I always end up playing it a second time. I certainly don't need to. So we are going to go into breakout groups. It'll take me just a moment to get everyone into them. I should have been doing that while the video was playing, but I was worried that I'd break it. So we're going to put everyone, you'll be in groups of 3 or 4, and you're going to be assigned some factors here. So this is a handout that's also available in Google Classroom. Sorry, I have trouble typing and talking at the same time. And so this is available in Google Classroom. I'm also going to drop it in the chat so you have it. And you'll be randomly assigned into groups. And what I'm hoping you'll do is the 2 strategies that you're assigned, these are all brain building strategies. The 2 that you're assigned, your group is assigned, just talk about them and then think through what is one way, or give an example of how you could implement that strategy into practice. So for example, if you're assigned to, be consistent in your relationships with young people, then you might come up with a couple of examples of how you would implement that in real life with a teenager or a young person that you're working with, and give some examples of what that looks like. Because it's easy to talk about these strategies very abstractly, right? And we all agree, these are great strategies. We should all be implementing these into our practice. But again, like I said, we work within a system that was not designed for this particular population, right? It's been adapted to try to serve this population. So we need to be much more intentional when we're talking about older youth, with adolescents, with teens in this. So kind of think of some examples where you could use, where you could apply these strategies into your work. So I have you ready to go in breakout rooms. And again, I dropped the full document in the chat box, but if you want to take a picture or a screenshot, this is also available in Google Classroom. So in group 1, it's the group that includes Rochelle. So if you're in Rochelle's group, you're going to be addressing numbers 1 and 2. The group that has Betty, you will be doing numbers 3 and 4. The group that has Tanya, you'll be doing numbers 5 and 6. And the group that has Julie, you'll be doing numbers 7 and 8. I also relabeled your breakout rooms with the numbers that you're doing. And the chat box document has them numbered. It's just chronological. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for about 12 minutes or so to think through this, share your own examples, kind of talk through some of this stuff, and then try to appoint someone to be a note taker or a scribe. And we'll report back and kind of talk back as a group and share some of our ideas and some of our examples so we can all learn from each other in our own work that we've done so far. Any questions before I push the blue button to get you into your breakout rooms? Okay, all right, I'm going to open those up and I will see you all here in about 12 minutes.
So is there any way that we can advocate to get new policies?
There's certainly a lot of work happening around that. So I think, yes, we should. Any opportunity that we have to make a difference on a policy level, 100% I'm always supportive of. But likewise, anything that we can do to, you know, on the local, like on a case level, on a child level, you know, how can we get creative? So let's hear from someone who had 1 and 2. I don't remember how the groups were. So that was be consistent in your relationships. Who was the reporter out? If you want to just share 1 or 2 examples from either strategy, just so we can kind of have some group share.
Deb, do you want to, or do you want me to?
Excuse me, I can do it. That's fine.
All right.
We talked about the consistency and being fair and increased expectations and so forth, and the constant support. So we kind of broke it down. Basically with teens, you have to be honest with them. If you're not honest and consistent with them at the beginning, you're going to lose ground with them quickly. And we talked about boundaries. They want the boundaries, whether they admit that or not, but they also need boundaries. And the consistency part, you can't blow it with them on that. You have to stay consistent, because once you lose ground with that, it's really hard to gain that back. And I don't know if we said it in those words, but similar. And the boundaries, I think, came across, we talked about more boundaries, I think, but more of, losing my thoughts here now, but the being fair with them and being honest with them, because if you're not honest with them, they pick up on that so quick, and you lose control of the conversation with them.
Great, thank you, Deb, for sharing. I think, you know, there's an art to that, staying true to that authenticity when you're working with young, you know, with young people, especially with teens, because they can see right through it, right, when you're not being authentic with them. So yes, thank you for sharing. How about our next breakout group that would have had 3 and 4? So that was the high expectations for young people and understanding and dealing with turnover and loss.
Yeah, that was our group, me. Great, and thanks, Betty and Rhonda. So so our group, we talked a lot about honesty, of course, and transparency and directness, but as far as communicating high expectations. We discussed some activities that could apply to like goal-oriented expectations, or also just kind of daily positive thinking expectations. So one strategy or activity we had talked about as a group is having, this is a idea I got from a friend that I would describe as a go-getter, but she told me to, gave me advice one time to take like a big sheet of paper and put whatever kind of idea or directive, goal, or just any kind of thing that was of value to me, to put it on this piece of paper and then hang these new pieces of paper all over your room. And so then it's, as a group, we discussed how an activity like that could be positive because it's a daily reminder for yourself, so you don't really ever get off track if you're always seeing it. And then the direct consequence, the positive consequence that you feel like when you accomplish a goal or a high expectation. And then also maybe the feeling of like disappointment or of not being self-accountable if maybe you're not accomplishing or staying on track with those expectations. So we thought like a visual activity could be beneficial. And then with communicating about with the caseworker turnover, that was a tough one. So we just talked about the importance, of course, of being really honest. If possible, it could be nice to involve caseworkers to have a bit of closure, offer opportunities for the youth to maybe ask questions or to help to understand that it's more of a system thing and not a direct reflection of working with them personally. So those are just some of the ideas that we had come up with.
Yeah, no, I love it. And, you know, being that person of, you know, if you think about all of the systems, all of the institutions, all of the different places that a young person is getting feedback, right? And being that place where you kind of insist on their future and you insist on the future that they envision for themselves and that you envision for them, that can be pretty powerful, right? We can do all the other things, right? We can reinforce all the other things we need to reinforce. But there's no rule that we can't do all of those other things and insist on moving forward in a constructive way and insist on that child's reminding them of their potential and talking about that in a really meaningful, like, we can do this kind of way. I've been working pretty closely over the last 6 or 7 weeks with a young person who's really struggling with what's, you know, kind of going on outside of their control. And one of the most, the thing I say to them most frequently is, this is really hard, yes, but I also know that you can do hard things, and kind of working through that with them, of just reminding this young person that they are capable of doing this, and you know, not diminishing how hard it is, how difficult it is, how traumatizing it is, but really kind of reinforcing that they can do this, they're worthy of it, that all of those things, and communicating those high expectations, you know, within reason, of course. Great. We are running a little short on time, so if from the other two groups, if you just want to share maybe one example from each group, and then we will close for the day.
We had groups, we were 5 and 6, and basically it was about talking to young people about what's going on in the brain, and also about discrimination and racial, you know, tensions or whatever. And basically our conversation was about, you know, helping kids understand all of this kind of gives them a purpose, and it helps them feel normal, that maybe they're having normal feelings, or, you know, but it also, you know, we were talking about empathy with the whole discrimination. And we said that the earlier you do it, you know, they get more trained where you make those synapses, those connections, and that will be more ingrained in them, I guess. So the earlier, the better. And then and then showing them a picture of the brain also can help them understand what's going on. So again, they can learn earlier. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah. No, great. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
All right. And then our last group, if you want to share, whichever group hasn't gone. I don't remember who was where.
You want to share, Nancy? You had some really good ideas, you and Debbie.
And Nancy, you're muted, just FYI.
I'd encourage Debbie to share her example because it was really good about the song.
Oh, great.
Not to put you on the spot, Deb, but.
And Debbie, if you are talking, you are muted.
Okay,
There you
I
are.
was. We talked about encouraging them to do things that were kind of out of their comfort zone. And I deal with a boy that he likes to sing, and he wants to sing in front of a group. And I told him on his next visit to practice and get some songs ready for me, I wanted him to sing in front of me just to get him in, out of that comfort zone. And it kind of made his eyes, his whole face, light up. But I think we do need to encourage teens to get out of their comfort zone and try new things.
Yeah, I think that's great. Kind of, again, encourage it, because we know that there's usefulness in those kind of healthy risks that we want to encourage teens. So kind of driving them that in direction. So many times we're focused on mitigating risk, right? Like the don't drink, don't do this, don't do that. But really kind of encouraging those, healthy risks. Those are really great growth opportunities.
We also talked about the driving. Do you know is that Ohio law that when kids are in foster care that they're not permitted to do like driver's training or driver's ed, because we think that's a real deterrent with kids if they can't do what other kids are doing.
Yeah, so that was part of that normalcy package that I mentioned last week with the reasonable and prudent parent standard. So it's not, there is a possibility within Ohio law for a child who's in state custody to obtain a driver's license. However, it's been left up to each individual county and each individual agency. So most agencies in Ohio have not reached a comfort level with children in their custody obtaining a driver's license. So, I think we'll see some evolution in that point. One thing that I think we can do is encourage as much of driver's education as possible, because what happens if a teenager turns 18 and leaves foster care? They're no longer required at 18 to complete driver's education, but they can go out and get a driver's license. So, if we're talking about preparing them for healthy adulthood, then it would certainly be in their best interest and the community's best interest for them to have driver's education if possible. So I've been really pushing as much as they can do. I know our Children's Services Agency is not liking them doing the driving portion of driver's ed. But really pushing for as much as possible, especially if we know that they might be looking into independent living when they turn 18. So I'll share that full legislation on Google Classroom once we sign off, if you all want to read it and just learn about if you want to look into individual opportunities to advocate, both at a local case level and then maybe at a bigger level. You can certainly explore those. So yes, I agree though, it comes up a lot. So, okay, well, we are going to wrap up for the day. We're just slightly over, but thank you all for participating today and engaging and kind of thinking through this. Next week, we'll continue talking about development and brain development, and specifically looking at regulation, the use of relationships in our supportive brain development, and again, that reward system that video talked about, and how we can kind of use that to our advantage when we're working with teens and adolescents. So I will see you all next Tuesday.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.